first time I stepped into her house, it felt like crossing into a place that wasn't meant for strangers. Everything about it was too still, too carefully arranged, as if time inside moved differently from the world outside. She met me at the door with a polite smile, the kind of smile that didn't invite questions, only obedience. Mid-40s, elegant without effort. She carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that made me straighten up without even realizing it. Her voice was steady when she spoke. Focus on my room only. Nothing more, no explanation. The words weren't cold, but they weren't casual either. It was the firmness of someone used to being obeyed, yet there was something beneath it too, something that made me wonder why she needed to say it at all. I nodded, trying not to let my curiosity show, and followed her down the narrow hallway. The air carried a faint trace of perfume, subtle and expensive, mixed with the clean scent of wood polish. When she opened the door to her room, I caught my breath. It wasn't just a bedroom. It felt like a world apart. The curtains were drawn just enough to let in soft daylight, golden threads of sun falling across the shelves stacked with books. The bed was neatly made, a single throw blanket folded with precision at the edge. Everything in that room seemed arranged with intention, like each object had a story only she knew. As I stepped inside, I felt something I couldn't name. Not attraction, not yet. It was more like being trusted with a secret. This was her private space, and she was letting me into it. My hands itched with nervous energy as I set my things down, aware of her watching. Her gaze wasn't heavy, but it lingered just long enough to make me wonder what she saw in me. "You'll manage here," she said, her tone softer this time. She brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, almost absent-mindedly, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of something else. Fatigue, maybe, or a weariness she was careful to hide. But just as quickly, her composure returned, and she gestured toward the shelves. "Start there." I did as told, running a cloth across the wood, trying to focus on the task instead of the awareness of her presence just a few feet away. Every small sound seemed magnified in the quiet, the whisper of fabric when she shifted her weight, the faint clink of a glass she set on the nightstand. She wasn't speaking, but the silence between us felt alive, humming with unspoken rules. And though I didn't dare ask, a thought lingered at the back of my mind. Why only her room? I had barely settled into the rhythm of working in her room when I first heard it, her sister's voice drifting down the hallway. Lighter, brighter, carrying a teasing lilt that made it impossible to ignore. "Hey, could you give me a hand for a second?" she called, her words casual, but her timing suspicious. I froze, glancing toward the door. The woman who had hired me wasn't there. She had stepped out a moment earlier. I hesitated, cloth still in my hand, the scent of polish lingering in the air. A part of me told myself to stay put, to honor the clear boundary I'd been given. But another part, the part that was young, curious, and maybe a little reckless, pushed me toward the hallway. Her sister was waiting just outside, leaning against the doorframe. She was close in age, maybe a year or two younger, but her energy couldn't have been more different. Where the first woman was measured and composed, this one was playful, her smile quick and mischievous. Her bracelets jingled as she gestured down the hall. "Come on, it won't take long." I followed, though something inside me tightened with guilt. Her room was a contrast to the others. Bright curtains thrown wide, the air filled with a stronger perfume, sweet and daring. Clothes were draped carelessly over a chair, books stacked without order. Where her sister's room felt like a sanctuary, this one felt alive, chaotic, unapologetically hers. "Hold this," she said, pressing a box into my arms before I had time to answer. Her fingers brushed mine. Light, intentional, lingering just a moment longer than necessary. When I looked up, her eyes were already on me, the kind of look that didn't hide curiosity. "You're new here," she said, almost like an accusation but softened by the grin tugging at her lips. "My sister doesn't usually let people into her space. You must have done something right." Her words stirred something in me, though I couldn't tell if it was pride or danger. She moved around me with ease, talking about little things, her laughter spilling freely, her presence magnetic in a way that pulled me off balance. Every time her hand brushed mine, I felt my chest tighten. But in the back of my mind, I could hear the echo of her sister's voice. Focus on my room only. I returned to it as soon as I could, the guilt heavier now. The air inside was cooler, quieter, as if it held me accountable. When she stepped back into the room, her eyes flicked toward me, searching for something I didn't want her to find. She didn't ask where I'd been. She didn't need to. The silence between us carried its own weight. And for the first time, I understood her warning wasn't about work. It was about something far more dangerous. The next morning, I thought I could pretend nothing had happened. I walked into her room with the same careful steps, the same attempt at focus. But the air between us had changed, even if she hadn't spoken a word yet. She was by the window, her hands busy tying the curtains back, letting the pale morning light spill across the room. Her movements were slow, deliberate, but her silence felt pointed. When she finally turned, her eyes found mine, and stayed there. I said, "Only my room." The words were soft, almost whispered, but they carried more weight than if she had shouted. She didn't ask for an explanation. She didn't accuse. She simply looked at me, and in that look I felt both guilt and something else, a kind of test I wasn't sure I could pass. "I'm sorry," I murmured, though even as the words left me, I knew they were only half the truth, because I hadn't gone to her sister's room out of duty. I'd gone because curiosity had gotten the better of me, because temptation had leaned close and smiled. She didn't respond. Instead, she walked past me, her shoulder brushing mine, and placed a folded sheet in my hands. The contact was brief but electric, my pulse jumping at the simple touch. She kept her eyes down as if it hadn't happened, but the silence that followed was alive with meaning. "Dust the shelves again," she said. It was an ordinary instruction, but her tone, measured, low, wrapped around me like a thread I couldn't escape. I obeyed, my hands moving across the familiar surfaces, but my thoughts were tangled. She moved quietly around the room, occasionally passing close, the faint rustle of her blouse the only sound in the stillness. Once, as she reached for a book, her hand brushed mine. Could have been accidental, could have been intentional. Either way, neither of us pulled back right away. For a heartbeat, the world stilled. The faint ticking of the clock, the filtered sunlight, the closeness of her skin near mine. When she finally withdrew, she did so with such careful grace it almost felt like a question left unanswered. I wanted to speak, to explain, to ask why it mattered so much that I stay here. But the words tangled in my throat. All I managed was silence. And in that silence, I felt her judgment and her forgiveness, both unspoken. By the time I left that evening, I understood something I hadn't before. Her rules weren't about work or order. They were boundaries meant to protect something fragile, something she wasn't ready to name out loud. And yet, even as I promised myself I would respect those boundaries, I couldn't ignore the way my heart quickened when her eyes lingered on me, or the way her nearness had already begun to undo me. That afternoon, the house was quieter than usual. Even the sister, whose voice usually bounced through the hallway, seemed absent. When I stepped back into her room, she wasn't waiting by the window or giving me instructions. She was seated at the edge of the bed, her back slightly curved, her hands clasped loosely in her lap. For the first time, she didn't look composed. She looked a human. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure if I should enter, but she gestured faintly, as if inviting me in without words. The air was warm, heavy with the faint fragrance of lavender. A golden strand of light stretched across the carpet, and she sat half in shadow, half in glow, like someone caught between two selves. "You work quietly," she said finally, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "It's different." I wasn't sure how to respond. Her tone carried something fragile, and I didn't want to break it with the wrong words. So I nodded, setting down the stack of books I'd been carrying. Her gaze drifted toward the shelves, then back to me. "This room," she began, then stopped. She exhaled slowly, as though deciding how much to share. "It's the only place I've kept for myself. Everyone else has a way of taking time, space, energy. But here I get to decide what stays and what doesn't." The admission was quiet, almost offhand, but it struck something in me. I looked around, the careful arrangement of books, the neatly folded blanket, the faint trace of perfume woven into the curtains. It wasn't just a room. It was her refuge. She smiled faintly, though her eyes didn't match the smile. "Maybe that's why I told you to stay here. I thought it would be simpler, safer." Her choice of words, safer, stirred something unspoken between us. I wanted to ask safer from what or from whom, but the look in her eyes told me not to press. Instead, I picked up one of the books from the shelf and handed it to her. Our fingers brushed, and for a heartbeat too long, neither of us moved. Her skin was warm, soft, and the small contact felt heavier than it should have. She finally took the book, cradling it in her lap, her thumb running absently along the spine. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was thick, layered, carrying weight neither of us named. She glanced at me then, her expression unreadable. Vulnerability flickered there, quickly buried beneath composure. "Thank you," she said at last. It was simple, but it carried an intimacy I couldn't ignore. I busied myself with arranging the rest of the shelf, but every nerve in my body was aware of her presence. The steady rhythm of her breathing, the soft creak of the bed when she shifted, the way the light touched the strands of her hair, making them glow like threads of fire. For the first time, I felt not like a worker in her room, but a guest in her life, and it unsettled me more than I was ready to admit. By the next day, I thought maybe the strange tension had settled, that whatever had been stirring beneath the surface would remain unspoken. But then her sister appeared again, and the fragile calm cracked apart. I had been in her room, dusting the shelves as usual, when a voice, bright, lilting, floated from the hallway. "There you are," the sister said, leaning casually against the doorframe. Her eyes sparkled with mischief, her smile quick and daring. "I was hoping you'd help me for a moment." I froze, the cloth still in my hand. I remembered the warning, the weight of it, but before I could answer, she tilted her head, bracelets chiming as she reached out and tugged lightly at my sleeve. "Come on. Don't be shy. It'll take only a minute." My heart thudded unevenly. Against my better judgment, I followed. Her room once again was a stark contrast. Sunlight poured through open curtains, spilling across the floor. A faintly sweet perfume lingered in the air, stronger than her sister's, floral, playful, almost intoxicating. Clothes draped casually over furniture, books and trinkets scattered in ways that felt both careless and inviting. "Hold this," she said, placing a stack of folded linens in my arms before brushing past me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her shoulder. Her laughter rang out as she caught the uncertain expression on my face. "Relax. You're not breaking any laws." Her words carried a double edge. I wasn't breaking a law, no, but I was breaking a promise. She moved with a confidence that unsettled me, circling back to take one of the linens, her hand grazing mine deliberately. The touch was quick, but the way her eyes held mine afterward left no doubt it had been intentional. "You're different," she said suddenly, almost studying me. "You're not like the others who've been here." I swallowed, unsure of how to respond. "I'm just doing my work." Her smile deepened. "Work doesn't explain the way you look at things, the way you hesitate. My sister sees it too, I'm sure." The mention of her sister's name sent a flicker of unease through me. My pulse quickened as I remembered the sharp look, the unspoken boundary. Yet standing here with this woman leaning in close, The danger carried its own kind of pull. She leaned nearer, lowering her voice. You don't always have to listen to her, you know? For a moment, the world seemed to shrink. The scent of her perfume filling my lungs, the sound of her bracelets chiming softly, the nearness of her gaze holding mine captive. I could almost forget where I was, almost forget the promise I had made. But somewhere, deep down, I knew this wasn't just playful teasing. It was a line being tested. When I finally excused myself and returned to the first woman's room, my chest felt heavy. I half expected her to ask where I'd been, to confront me outright. But she didn't. She only looked at me, steady, unreadable. And in her silence, I felt the weight of every choice I had made. That evening, the house felt different. The hallways that once echoed with voices were hushed, the kind of silence that made each step sound louder than it should. I walked slowly toward her room, my pulse quickening, not because of what I might find, but because of what I might have to choose. She was already inside, seated at the small table by the lamp. The warm glow lit her profile, softening the edges of her face, making her look younger, almost fragile. She didn't rise when I entered. She didn't need to. Her eyes lifted, found mine, and in that single glance I knew she was aware. You stayed, she said simply. The words were neither praise nor question. They were acknowledgement, spoken in a tone that carried more weight than a dozen explanations. I set my things down carefully, as though the smallest noise might break the moment. My throat tightened, the memory of her sister's laughter still lingering, the scent of her perfume clinging faintly to my clothes. Guilt pressed hard against my chest, but her voice pulled me back here, back to where I belonged, or at least where I wanted to belong. She gestured faintly to the chair beside her. I sat, the space between us impossibly small. Our shoulders were close enough that if either of us shifted, they would touch. The lamp cast a circle of light around us, leaving the rest of the room in shadow. It felt like the world had narrowed to just this, her presence, her silence, the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat in my ears. Neither of us spoke for a long time. She rested her hands on the table, fingers curled slightly, her nails tracing invisible lines against the wood. I wanted to reach out, to cover her hand with mine, to tell her I understood even if I didn't fully. But something held me back, the same restraint that had guided every unspoken rule between us. When she finally broke the silence, her voice was low, almost tender. It's easier to leave when someone calls. Harder to stay when everything tells you not to. Her words weren't about cleaning, and we both knew it. I turned toward her, and for the first time, I let my gaze linger. The faint lines near her eyes, the way her hair fell just past her shoulders, the strength in her posture tempered by quiet vulnerability. She met my stare, unflinching, and something passed between us. An understanding, unvoiced but undeniable. I wanted to tell her that I hadn't stayed out of obligation, that every choice, every step back into this room was mine. Instead, I let the silence speak for me. And in that silence, her lips curved into the faintest smile, one so subtle I might have missed it if I wasn't watching her so closely. The clock ticked steadily in the background. Outside, the world went on. But here, in this narrow circle of light, time seemed to pause. And I realized I had chosen. The following days unfolded in a quiet rhythm, as if the house itself had adjusted to something unspoken between us. The sister, once ever-present and insistent, grew quieter. I would catch glimpses of her now and then in the hallway, her smile still playful but softer, less demanding. She seemed to sense the choice had already been made, and though she never said it aloud, her silence carried its own acceptance. It was in her room, always her room, where the final thread of tension unraveled. I arrived one evening to find her by the window, the curtains drawn back, moonlight spilling across the floorboards. She didn't look up right away, her fingers tracing the edge of the windowsill as though lost in thought. When she turned, her eyes lingered on me for a long time, Not searching, not testing, just seeing. You never asked why I told you to stay, she said quietly. I swallowed, my throat tight. I figured you had your reasons. Her lips curved into something between a smile and a sigh. I did. But maybe I was also afraid. The admission surprised me. She had always seemed so composed, so certain. But now, with the silver light framing her face, I saw the truth beneath the surface. Not weakness, something deeper. A vulnerability she had guarded with rules and silence. Afraid of what? I asked. She took a step closer, her bare feet making no sound against the wooden floor. Of losing what little peace I've managed to keep. Of letting someone in, only to regret it later. Her words struck me in a place I didn't expect. Because I had been afraid too. Afraid of overstepping, of wanting too much, of crossing a line I could never uncross. I don't want to take anything from you, I said softly. I just want to be here. Something shifted in her eyes then, a flicker of relief, or maybe recognition. She moved closer still, until the space between us narrowed to a breath. Her hand lifted hesitantly, then rested over mine on the table. The contact was light, tentative, yet it carried the weight of everything we hadn't said. Her thumb brushed against my skin, a slow, deliberate motion. You stayed, she whispered again. But this time the words held no test, no question, only gratitude. I tightened my hand gently around hers, not to claim, but to assure. Outside, the world was wide, complicated, filled with judgment and noise. But here, in this room, there was only her and me, and the quiet certainty of a bond neither of us had planned for. We didn't speak of the future. We didn't need to. The silence that settled between us was not the heavy kind we had once shared, but something warmer, steadier, an unspoken promise. And as I sat there, her hand resting in mine beneath the silver wash of moonlight, I knew this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, one that would not be rushed, one that didn't need certainty tonight. Only presence, only choice, together, but uncertain. Yet somehow, that felt enough.